It's just gone 4 in the morning on a Sunday in Birmingham, Alabama, and a car full of young people is pulling away from a nightclub called Onyx. The music's still ringing in their ears. Everyone's had a few drinks. And in that car, a 19-year-old woman named Mya Parker is doing something that couples do in cars outside clubs all over the world. Every weekend, she's arguing with the man she's seeing. It's the kind of argument that, on any other night, ends with someone sulking, someone apologizing, everyone waking up hungover and a little embarrassed. It is not supposed to end with gunfire. It is not supposed to end with a teenager who had just landed her first real job, pronounced dead less than an hour later. But that's exactly what happened. 2 shots, fired in the dark, on a quiet stretch of road in West Birmingham. 1 woman dead. Another wounded, and a birthday celebration that ended with the man being celebrated pulling the trigger. To understand how this case unfolded, and how quickly it could have slipped past without much notice, you have to understand the city it happened in. By late May of 2024, Birmingham, Alabama had already logged dozens of homicides for the year. Different outlets put the running count anywhere from the low 50s to the mid-50s, depending on which cases were still being classified as criminal homicides versus justifiable killings at the time. Mya Parker's death was one of them, reported in the immediate aftermath as being somewhere around the city's 51st of the year. The exact number matters less than what it represents, a city that had already logged more killings than most American cities see in an entire year. It takes the details who she was, who he was, and exactly what happened between them that night to turn a statistic back into a story. So let's start with who she was. Mya Rae Parker was 19 years old, and by every account of the people who knew her, she was a young woman just getting started. She'd graduated high school not long before, having spent most of her school years in Gardendale, a suburb just north of Birmingham, before finishing up at Minor High School. In the weeks leading up to her death, her life had genuinely been on the upswing. She'd just landed a new job in environmental services at the University of Alabama at Birmingham UAB, one of the city's largest employers, and the kind of place where a steady entry-level job can be the first real foothold into independent adult life. She was due to start orientation within the week. It's worth sitting with that detail for a moment, because it's easy to skim past it in a story that's mostly going to be about violence. Mya Parker wasn't in trouble. She wasn't caught up in anything dangerous. She had just done the thing that 19-year-olds are supposed to do: found a job, made plans, started building a future one orientation session at a time. She would never get to start it. What she also had, in the weeks before her death, was a relatively new relationship. She'd been seeing a man named Jeremiah Pressley, 23 years old at the time, from Birmingham, for what witnesses would later describe in court as a short period, not a marriage, not even, by most measures, a long-term relationship, just the early, still-forming stage of something that, on the night of May 25, 2024, was about to end in the worst way imaginable. May 25, 2024, was Jeremiah Pressley's 23rd birthday, and like a lot of people do, he wanted to celebrate with a night out. The group that gathered wasn't large. There was Pressley himself, Mya Parker, Parker's friend Jada Eatmon, and another young man along for the night. Their destination was Onyx, a nightclub in Birmingham, the kind of place where a birthday gets celebrated with music, drinks, and a night that's supposed to end in nothing more dramatic than a hangover the next morning. For a while, it probably looked exactly like that. But somewhere in the course of the evening, something shifted. According to testimony later given in court by Jada Eatmon, who was there for all of it, and who would go on to become the prosecution's first witness at trial, Parker began growing upset that Pressley seemed to be paying more attention to other women in the club than to her. He was, in her view, flirting, dancing with people who weren't her, on his own birthday, with his own girlfriend right there in the room. What happened next is the kind of thing that, in hindsight, reads like the first domino falling. Rather than the tension cooling down, Eatmon testified that both Parker and Pressley began flirting with other people themselves, each one, it seems, trying to make the other jealous in return. It's a dynamic a lot of people will recognize. Hurt feelings, curdling into point scoring, both people trying to win an argument that hadn't technically even started yet. Eatmon, for her part, said she felt caught in the middle of it all night, watching 2 people she cared about escalate a night that was supposed to be a celebration into something tenser and more combustible. By the time the club was ready to close, that tension hadn't dissipated. If anything, it had hardened. And it followed all four of them out into the parking lot and into the car. It was around 4 in the morning on Sunday, May 26th, when the group finally left Onyx. The plan, according to Eatmon's later testimony, was simple. Drop the men off at home, then take Parker over to Eatmon's cousin's house, maybe grab something to eat. The kind of low-key after-hours plan that winds down a night out for thousands of people every weekend. It didn't play out that way. The arguing that had started inside the club didn't stop once everyone piled into the car. If anything, it intensified. At one point, Eatmon testified, Pressley leaned out of the vehicle and called over to a group of women standing outside, asking them what they were doing for the rest of the night. If the goal had been to needle Parker one more time, it worked. The argument inside that car kept building, layer on layer, the kind of circular escalating fight that couples have when neither person is willing to be the one who backs down first. At some point during that drive, Pressley had had enough, or Parker had. It's not entirely clear which of them reached the breaking point first. What is clear, based on trial testimony, is that Pressley gathered his belongings and got out of the car, and Parker followed him out, continuing to argue in the open. But the confrontation didn't end there. At some point, both women ended up back in, or right at the vehicle, a detail that matters, because it's the reason this was charged as capital murder in the first place. Under Alabama law, killing someone while they're inside a vehicle is one of the specific aggravating factors that elevates a homicide to the state's most serious charge, and prosecutors built the case on the fact that Mya Parker was in that car when the gun went off. Neither of them could have known it, but Mya Parker had just made the last decision of her life. What exactly was said in those final moments, what pushed an argument that had been simmering for hours into gunfire, is something only Jeremiah Pressley truly knows. What isn't in dispute is what happened next. Pressley fired 2 shots into the vehicle. One struck Mya Parker in the neck. The other hit Jada Eatmon, the friend who had spent the entire night trying to keep the peace between them, and who was also still in or near the car, in the leg. In the space of a few seconds, an argument between 2 people in a relationship that had barely gotten off the ground had turned into a shooting that left one woman fighting for her life and another wounded, both a world away from the birthday celebration they'd started the night at just hours earlier. Birmingham police were dispatched to the 1000 block of Graymont Avenue at 10th Street West at around 4:30 that morning, responding to a report of a person shot. When West Precinct officers arrived, they found a vehicle off the roadway, and inside it, or near it, 2 women, both suffering from gunshot wounds. Birmingham Fire and Rescue got both of them to area hospitals as fast as they could. It wasn't fast enough for Mya Parker. She was rushed to UAB Hospital, the very institution where, within days, she was supposed to have begun a new job and, pronounced dead, Jada Eatmon survived. Her injuries, mercifully, were not life-threatening, though she'd carry the physical and emotional weight of that morning for a long time to come. By the time the sun came up over Birmingham, a 19-year-old who had been set to start a new job within the week was gone, and the man who had celebrated his birthday with her the night before was nowhere to be found. In the immediate aftermath, Birmingham police had a homicide investigation and very little else to go on publicly. Officers described the case, in the department's earlier statements, in sparse terms, details limited, no one in custody, the investigation open. But behind the scenes, they had something far more valuable, a witness who had been in that car all night and had seen essentially everything. Jada Eatmon, recovering from her own gunshot wound, was able to identify who had pulled the trigger. That gave detectives a name almost immediately, even if it didn't give them a suspect in custody. Investigators built out the picture of what had happened at Onyx and in the argument that followed, and took what they had to the Jefferson County District Attorney's office. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence, and detectives obtained an arrest warrant, not for simple murder, but for capital murder, on the basis that Mya Parker had been inside a vehicle at the moment she was shot. Under Alabama law, that single fact where the victim was physically located in the instant the shooting happened is enough on its own to elevate a homicide charge to the most serious category the state has. For a few days, Jeremiah Pressley remained a wanted man rather than an arrested one. Then, over the following weekend, he made the decision to turn himself in. He walked into Birmingham police custody voluntarily, was booked into the Jefferson County jail, and was held without bond, the standard practice for a capital murder charge in Alabama, one serious enough that judges typically don't even consider release an option. It's worth pausing here on what capital murder actually means, because it shapes almost everything that came after. In Alabama, capital murder isn't simply a more serious label attached to the same crime. It's a specific legal category, tied to aggravating circumstances, written directly into state law. Killing someone while they're inside a vehicle is one of those circumstances, alongside things like killing a police officer or killing more than one person in a single act. The designation doesn't automatically mean prosecutors are seeking the death penalty. That's a separate decision, but it does mean the case carries the heaviest possible weight the Alabama justice system can put on a homicide charge. From the moment Pressley turned himself in, he was facing the harshest end of what the law allows. Here's something that often gets lost in true crime coverage, because it doesn't make for dramatic television: the wait. Between the night Mya Parker died and the moment a jury finally heard the case against Jeremiah Pressley, roughly 2 years passed. 2 years in which Pressley sat in the Jefferson County jail. 2 years in which Mya Parker's family had a homicide charge on the books, but no verdict, no closure, nothing but the slow, grinding machinery of a capital case, working its way through a court system that handles serious cases with extreme caution. Capital murder trials in Alabama move slowly, and for good reason. With a defendant's entire future on the line, courts build in the kind of procedural safeguards, pre-trial motions, and scheduling delays that lesser criminal charges simply don't require. For the people who loved Mya Parker, that meant living for 2 years with an open wound. The legal system wasn't yet ready to let them begin closing. It's one of the least visible cruelties of a case like this one. The violence happens in a single, terrible moment, but the process of the state formally answering for it can stretch out for years. That wait finally ended when Jeremiah Pressley's trial opened before Jefferson County Circuit Judge Stephen Wallace. The case was prosecuted by Jefferson County Chief Deputy District Attorney Joe Roberts, alongside Deputy District Attorney Julie McMakin. Pressley was represented by Malcolm Head and Chad Black of the Jefferson County Public Defender's Office. From the opening statements, it was clear the two sides weren't really disputing what had happened on Graymont Avenue that morning. Nobody was arguing that Pressley hadn't fired the shots the physical evidence and Eatmon's account made that essentially unchallengeable. What the trial actually turned on was intent, whether Pressley had meant to kill Mya Parker, which is what a capital murder conviction legally requires, or whether what happened was something less deliberate, born out of chaos, alcohol, and a fight that had simply spiraled out of anyone's control. Roberts, for the prosecution, framed it in blunt terms right from the start. For the defendant to take Mya's life at just 19 years old, in such a violent way and over a silly argument, there must be consequences for this, he told the jury in his opening statement, a line that did double duty, both making the moral case plainly and quietly previewing the prosecution's central argument, that whatever the argument had actually been about, it didn't remotely justify what Pressley chose to do in response to it. The defense didn't dispute the tragedy of what had happened. What Head asked the jury to focus on instead was the question of Pressley's state of mind in the seconds before he fired. "You're not here just to hear the story of a life cut short," he told jurors. "You're here to determine the thought, the intent, or lack thereof, before the shots." It was, in essence, an argument that this was a killing that unfolded in the middle of what he called boozy, late-night drama, a chaotic, alcohol-fueled blow-up, rather than a calculated act, and that under the law, that difference mattered enormously. Jada Eatmon took the stand as the prosecution's first witness, and her account became the backbone of the trial. The argument at Onyx, the mutual jealousy, the plan to drop everyone home, the shouted comment to the women outside the car, the confrontation that spilled out of the vehicle and then came back to it, and finally, the 2 shots. She was, in the most literal sense possible, the only other person who had been present for the entire arc of that night, from the dance floor to the moment the gun went off. Her survival, and her willingness to testify against the very man who had also shot her, gave the jury a full, continuous account of exactly how a birthday celebration became a homicide. There was one more twist before the case went to the jury. Pressley had initially indicated he wanted to take the stand in his own defense, to explain, presumably, what had actually been going through his mind in that final confrontation. In the end, he reconsidered and never testified. Whatever explanation existed for those 2 shots, the jury would have to reach its verdict without ever hearing it directly from the one person who truly knew. After both sides rested, Judge Wallace gave the jury 3 possible outcomes to consider: capital murder, felony murder, or manslaughter, a ladder of charges running from the most severe, requiring proof of clear and deliberate intent to kill, down to something closer to a reckless, unintended death. The jury deliberated for a little over an hour. When they returned, they had chosen the most severe option on the table. Jeremiah Isaiah Pressley was found guilty of capital murder in the death of Mya Parker. It's a verdict worth sitting with for a moment, because of how quickly it came. An hour and 15 minutes of deliberation, for a decision that would define the rest of a 25-year-old man's life, tells you something about how clearly the jury saw the evidence in front of them. They weren't wrestling with reasonable doubt about who pulled the trigger. Nobody, including the defense, had ever disputed that. What they were deciding was intent, the exact question the defense had spent the entire trial asking them to focus on. And in a little over an hour, they decided that intent was there. Think about what that verdict actually required the jury to conclude. Capital murder isn't a charge that can be reached through recklessness, or even through a single moment of blind rage that nobody planned for. It requires the jury to find that Pressley specifically intended to cause Mya Parker's death, not that he intended merely to scare her, not that he fired without thinking about who might be hit, but that he meant, in that moment on Graymont Avenue, to kill her. The defense had spent the trial trying to plant doubt about exactly that distinction, arguing that a chaotic, alcohol-soaked fight in the small hours of the morning was a poor setting in which to prove the kind of clear, deliberate intent the law demands. The jury didn't buy it. Outside the courtroom, Prosecutor Joe Roberts spoke about what the verdict meant. "We are thankful to the Birmingham Police Department for their work on this investigation and prosecution, and to Mya's family for trusting us to obtain justice for Mya," he said. It was, in its own understated way, an acknowledgement of just how long that family had been waiting for exactly this outcome. 2 years of a homicide case, sitting unresolved, finally given a name and a verdict. Under Alabama law, a capital murder conviction usually opens the door to 2 possible sentences: life without the possibility of parole, or death. But this case was never charged as death penalty eligible in the first place, which meant that the moment the jury returned its guilty verdict, Pressley's fate was effectively decided. Judge Wallace has yet to formally set a sentencing date, but there is no real suspense in what that sentencing hearing will ultimately produce. The only sentence available to the court is life in prison, without the possibility of parole. As Roberts put it plainly after the verdict, because the defendant was convicted of capital murder, his only sentencing option is life without parole, and that is exactly what he deserves for such a violent and senseless murder. Jeremiah Pressley, now 25, will spend the rest of his life in an Alabama prison. He was 23 the night he fired a gun twice into a parked car on Graymont Avenue. Barring any successful appeal, he will spend more years behind bars than he had spent alive up to that point, decades stretching out ahead of him in a cell, in exchange for 2 shots fired in a matter of seconds. There's no elaborate criminal enterprise anywhere in this story, no years-long conspiracy, no wall of silence, no network of people covering for each other. Just a birthday, a nightclub, a relationship that was barely a few weeks or months old, and an argument about jealousy that any couple, anywhere, could have walked away from the next morning without a second thought. That's exactly what makes it worth sitting with. Mya Parker didn't die because she got mixed up in anything dangerous. She died sitting in a car on a residential street at 4 in the morning, arguing with a man who owned a gun and who, when an argument he was already losing control of reached its peak, chose to use it. Twice, on the woman he'd been dating for a matter of weeks, and then on her friend, who had spent the whole night trying, and failing, to keep the 2 of them from reaching exactly this point. Jada Eatmon survived, and in doing so, gave prosecutors the account that would ultimately convict the man who shot them both. Mya Parker's family got what Joe Roberts called justice, a verdict, and a sentence that will keep Jeremiah Pressley behind bars for the rest of his life. But no verdict gives Mya Parker back the job she never got to start, the orientation session she never got to attend, the life that, by every account of the people who knew her, was just beginning to take real shape in the weeks before she died. Birmingham logged her death as one of dozens of homicides recorded in the city that year. Reports at the time placed her among the low to mid-50s on the running count. By the end of that year, the number would climb higher still. Somewhere in that list of statistics is a teenager who spent most of her school years in Gardendale, graduated from minor high school, and was, in the truest sense of the phrase, just getting started, until an argument that began over dancing at a nightclub ended, a few hours later, with 2 shots fired into a car on a quiet residential street in Birmingham, Alabama. That's where we leave this one. If this case affected you the way it affected us putting it together, let us know in the comments below, and if you want more cases like this one, breaking down exactly what happened and why, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. We'll see you then.